by a second phase in 2021, a crucial aspect of which was the selective and intense crackdown on political opponents to pave the way for the unfettered re-election of President Ortega. The authorities carried out arbitrary detentions and spurious prosecutions of opponents. They abolished political parties and also undertook the arrests of presidential candidates. The shrinking of civic space and the full frontal assault on the freedom of expression served to consolidate power in the hands of the executive. The third phase occurred in 2022. One of its chief hallmarks was the elimination of the few remaining pockets of political opposition in Nicaragua. The third phase culminated in arbitrary arrests, deportations, the closure of media channels, and the cancelling of the legal status of thousands of non-profit organizations, as well as of universities and media companies. The attacks targeting the Catholic Church were also ramped up exponentially in this third phase. The fourth phase began in 2023 and continues to date. Not satisfied with silencing any remaining critical voices in the country, the authorities have also sought to exercise control over Nicaraguans living abroad. The authorities have expelled or banned from entry back into the country hundreds of Nicaraguans and have arbitrarily deprived of their nationality at least 453, Nicaraguan citizens. The sheer scope of the recent constitutional reform, which has been in force since it was gazetted on the 18th of February 2025, strikes at the very heart of what should be a division of powers, as well as at the rule of law and the institutional framework of Nicaragua. The content and scope of the aforementioned reform serves to confirm one of our principal concerns, to wit the reality of the total co-opting of the powers of the state in the hands of the executive alone, at the beck and call of a repressive architecture which has a veneer of illegality under the new constitution of the state. Distinguished delegates, as I believe emerges very clearly from the report that we have submitted to you for your consideration and the diagrams contained in the annex of said report, over the last year, state, parastatal institutions and the governing party, the Frente Sandinista para la Liberación Nacional, the FSLN, have merged together in a single machine of persecution wielded against all those who are perceived to be political opponents or dissident voices. Said apparatus has been further entrenched thanks to an extensive intelligence network that spies on the whole population and identifies targets for persecution. A network which provides the eyes and ears that allows the authorities to exercise and maintain complete control over persons remaining in the country. The patterns of human rights violations and the profiles of the victims of those violations reveal a clearly defined and discriminatory objective, to wit, absolute control over the entire population, both within and without Nicaragua, for political ends. Alongside extrajudicial executions, torture, and the arbitrary detentions described as occurring during the first phase of the authorities' operations, we are now witnessing the confiscation of assets, the freezing of pensions, expulsions and deportations, and the arbitrary stripping of nationality, all hallmarks of the fourth phase of the government strategy. In the almost 7 years of this crisis, since the crisis first broke out in 2018 up until today, thousands of Nicaraguans of all ages have suffered a full-fledged assault on their very lives, their physical well-being, their freedom of expression, their education, their nationality, and/or their right to have access to justice, to mention just some of the rights that have been violated and trampled upon. Your Excellencies, the group has reached the conclusion that the repressive apparatus that we have described is directly controlled by President Ortega and by Vice President Murillo, with the direct support also of high-level civil servants in all branches of power, as well as by members of the FSLN government party. The command chains have been designed to resemble and to operate like tentacles, with the intention of guaranteeing direct control over the various links in the chain at the different levels to ensure the enforcement of centralized strategies. The group has reasonable and credible grounds to believe that it will be possible to establish the individual responsible of some of those persons who are acting as nexuses in the command hierarchy, and their names will be duly identified in a session document to be published at the end of this 58th session of the Human Rights Council. Your Excellencies, the human rights situation and the rule of law in Nicaragua have suffered a deep-rooted deterioration. There is an urgent and pressing need for action by the international community, focused in particular on the following points. First, strengthening support for Nicaraguan civil society, including financial and technical assistance to civil society organizations and media companies so that they can withstand state repression. Second, there is an urgent need to pursue accountability measures before the International Court of Justice in response to Nicaragua's violations of its international obligations with regard to the United Nations Convention Against Torture and the cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, as well as under the Convention to reduce cases of statelessness. The third urgent action that the international community should undertake is expanding specific legal measures, such as sanctions targeting individuals, institutions, or entities identified in the reports submitted by the group, as well as those who will be duly identified in the session document to be published before the 4th of April. Fourth, we will call upon the international community to protect those Nicaraguans deprived of their nationality or who have been expelled from the country or whose return to the country has been denied. In particular, we call upon the international community to guarantee the granting of refugee status to these Nicaraguans and a fair asylum process. We would also call upon the international community to facilitate the administrative process for those persons who are victims of the arbitrary refusal to issue their passports or identity documents. Our fifth appeal to the international community is that you take steps to guarantee that human rights considerations are duly integrated in international decisions. Based on the findings of the group, for example, ensure that human rights considerations are duly integrated into the consultations under Article 4 of the International Monetary Fund, in particular as they pertain to recommendation number 8 of the International Finance Action Group. Similar steps could be taken with regard to trade agreements, where we call upon the international community to make full use of human rights conditions. For example, these could be integrated into the free trade agreement between the European Union and Central America. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Merci.
Thank you. I understand that the delegation of Nicaragua is not present in the room. I therefore invite interested delegations to put questions to the presenters and to make comments on the presentation that we have just heard. I recall that the speaking time is limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds for each intervention. The list of speakers is now closed, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I speak on behalf of the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. We align with the statement to be made by the European Union, and we thank the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua for their report. We regret Nicaragua's announcement to disengage from the Human Rights Council. The human rights situation in Nicaragua has continued to deteriorate. The recent adoption of legal reforms by the country's legislature will worryingly lead to further human rights violations. We reiterate our concern about the continuous attempts to silence dissent by targeting and criminalizing the opposition, human rights defenders, journalists, as well as students and university professors. Threats, arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, torture, and other forms of ill treatment as well as citizenship removals must end immediately. In addition, we are troubled about the lack of protection for victims of rape and the current state of legislation preventing them from accessing safe abortion, including for child victims. Besides constituting a blatant violation of the right to live with dignity, forcing women and girls that are victims of rape to carry their pregnancies to term exposes them to extreme psychological and physical distress, which in certain cases can amount to torture. We urge the government to address the plight of sexual violence and to provide women and girls with adequate abortion services as well as sexual and reproductive health.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries. We welcome the group of experts' valuable work. We regret the recent announcement by Nicaragua to leave the Human Rights Council. We remain deeply concerned about the ongoing series of constitutional reforms and dismantling of democratic norms and institutions in Nicaragua, including the deletion of the explicit prohibition of torture. The government must stop the systematic repression and violations against human rights defenders, as well as political, religious and indigenous leaders. The government must secure the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and allow civil society organizations and universities to operate freely and return the property that has been confiscated. We urge releasing all political prisoners unconditionally and cease the practice of forced exile. Citizenship must be restored to persons who have been arbitrarily deprived of it and their safe return ensured. Their legal records, access to bank accounts and confiscated property should be restored to the full. Distinguished experts, how can we ensure the human rights for Nicaraguans and stop the democratic backsliding of the country? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, the European Union thanks the experts for the report, which clearly documents the deteriorating situation of human rights in Nicaragua. The EU will support the renewal of your mandate. We take note with regret of Nicaragua's announcement that they would disengage from the HRC. We are concerned about the rewriting of the Constitution, which is another step away from democracy and the rule of law, consolidating the concentration of powers and further undermining human rights and fundamental freedoms. The EU calls for the end of repression, including transnational repression against dissenting voices, political opponents, journalists, civil society, NGOs and religious institutions. We also call for the release of all those arbitrarily arrested. The EU deplores reports of torture and degrading treatment of these prisoners, the targeting of their relatives, forced expulsion, stripping of citizenship and confiscation of property. We call for the full adherence of international law and obligations. We urge Nicaragua to receive and cooperate with international human rights organizations, the group of experts and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. The EU reaffirms its support to the Nicaraguan people and to all efforts aimed at finding a democratic, peaceful and negotiated solution to the ongoing political crisis. Mr. Simon, what is the impact of the constitutional reform, including the creation of a voluntary police force?
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador on behalf of a group of countries.
President, I am delivering this statement on behalf of the core group on the resolution on the human rights situation in Nicaragua, comprising Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Paraguay and Peru. We regret Nicaragua's decision announced yesterday to further disengage from the Human Rights Council, stating that it would withdraw and refrain from engaging in any activity related to the mandate of this body. This action constitutes an alarming sign of isolation, an attempt to duck its responsibility with regard to its international human rights obligations. We also deplore the recent reform of more than 100 articles of the Constitution, which has served to undermine the fundamental and core principles of democracy, inter alia the elimination of the principle of respect for human dignity, the separation of powers, the ban on censorship of the media and the protection from any form of torture. We call upon the Nicaraguan authorities to reconsider their decision to further disengage from this Human Rights Council and its activities, and we reiterate the need for Nicaragua to cooperate fully with international human rights mechanisms, as well as to take urgent steps to restore civic space, to put an end to the perpetration of serious and systematic violations of human rights targeting multiple different stakeholders, and also restore the full effectiveness of human rights in the country in line with the principles of a democratic state and a state in which the rule of law prevails. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. It is my honor to take the floor speaking on behalf of the group of friends of the Charter of the United Nations. We would like to take this opportunity as a group to reiterate our categorical rejection of double standards and the politicization of human rights, bearing in mind that such an approach is an enemy to authentic dialogue and cooperation. We also take this opportunity to voice our deep-rooted concern in light of the ongoing and growing proliferation of parallel reporting mechanisms and procedures, which claim to carry out supposedly impartial assessments and evaluations of the human rights situation in given states such as Nicaragua. However, the aforementioned evaluations do not just lack the due consent of the state in question, but also the reports are often based on carefully selected sources that are anonymous, unreliable, and of dubious veracity, biased, and lack any credibility and objectivity, all of which means that those reports end up being mere propaganda pamphlets. The group of friends wishes to take this opportunity to reiterate its robust condemnation of the sustained and growing deployment of unilateral coercive measures aimed at furthering an interventionist agenda and a destabilizing agenda, both politically and economically speaking, that has had an inverse impact on the full enjoyment of human rights of the people of Nicaragua. We reiterate our call for a constructive and non-politicized approach to dialogue based on human rights, based on genuine cooperation, mutual understanding, and full respect for national sovereignty and the principle of non-interference in internal affairs. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Mr. President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the group of experts for their report. We regret Nicaragua's decision to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. We condemn in the strongest terms the widespread and systematic human rights violations committed by the state of Nicaragua, especially its crackdown on civic and democratic space. The human rights situation in Nicaragua shows no signs of improvement. Expulsion of priests and nuns, the removal of the prohibition of torture from the Constitution, the abolition of the division of powers, re-entry bans for an increasing number of citizens, these developments clearly show that Nicaragua is in fact going in the opposite direction. We call on Nicaragua to cease all reprisals against Nicaraguans for exercising freedoms of expression and opinion, assembly and association, and to release all political prisoners. We call on Nicaragua to return citizenship and property rights to those who have been deported and expropriated. We call on all member states to support the mandate renewal of the group of human rights experts. Honored experts, how can we jointly prevent that financing streams contribute to human rights violations in Nicaragua? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Costa Rica.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Costa Rica thanks the group of experts for their report, which once again, underpinned by the schematic diagrams it contains, exposes a systematic and targeted pattern of violations and human rights abuses in Nicaragua and the structure of repression and crackdown which has become further entrenched in that country. One of the most alarming findings contained in the report is the ongoing arbitrary stripping of nationality. Hundreds of persons have been stripped of their documents without access to any legal protection as a result, and their goods and assets have been confiscated. They have become de facto stateless persons, facing an uncertain future and without any country to go back to. It is also inexplicable that the ban on torture has been eradicated from the Nicaraguan constitution, a further signal of the very troubling human rights situation in that country. The recent reform of 100 articles of the Constitution has concentrated absolute power in the hands of the executive and eliminated any fiction of an independence of powers in the country. In addition to allowing for persecution and crackdown, this reform has legalized such crackdowns and such repression, leaving many of the population without any protection guarantees. The last vestiges of the rule of law have been stepped away, and an unprecedented authoritarianism has taken root. Given this situation, it is vital that the international community ramps up the attention that it pays to the human rights situation in Nicaragua, and that this Human Rights Council continues to wield all the tools at its disposal to bring about positive change and make a positive difference in the human rights of Nicaraguans. Thank you very much.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
I'm much obliged to you, President. We align ourselves with the statement delivered by the European Union. We thank the OHCHR for all their hard work, and we also convey our gratitude to the group of experts for their report, which details the very troubling human rights situation in Nicaragua with a picture of serious violations. This situation has become all the more worse with the constitutional reform, which inter alia has led to an unprecedented concentration of power in the hands of the governing family. To avoid and prevent cases of statelessness, we have granted citizenship to those Nicaraguans who have been arbitrarily stripped of their nationality. And we have also helped to resettle exiled Nicaraguans. But these cannot be long-term systematic solutions. Rather, we demand the Nicaraguan authorities to fulfill their international obligations and to refrain from using the stripping of the citizenship rights of their people as a weapon that they wield against their own population. We regret the fact that Nicaragua has decided to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. It is the third country to do so over the last few days, 3 very significant steps taken. We call upon Nicaragua to put an immediate end to repression, and we reiterate our call for the immediate release of all political prisoners, for the dismissal of their trials or the accusations against them, the restoration of the rights of all citizens, and the lifting of restrictions on civil society. Members of the expert group, what international anti-impunity and accountability mechanisms do you think we should be applying against Nicaragua at this stage? Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la...
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland. Thank you, President. Switzerland thanks the group of experts for the presentation of its report and reaffirms its full support for their mandate. We very much regret restrictions on access to the country and the lack of cooperation by the authorities with international human rights mechanisms. We also regret the decision by the government of Nicaragua to take no further part in the work of this council. We commend the work of the group with a view to establishing responsibility for grave human rights violations that have taken place since 2018, and we call for perpetrators to be brought to justice. We are especially alarmed by the constitutional reform of the 30th of January, which establishes executive power without checks or balances, thereby undermining the fundamental principles of the rule of law. We call on the authorities to re-establish the separation of powers and guarantee fundamental freedoms. We also call for an immediate end to the repression of civic space, closing of media and NGOs, and persecution of vulnerable groups. The authorities must guarantee the rights of persons arbitrarily detained and order their immediate release. Distinguished experts, what are the most urgent forms of support to allow civil society, independent media, and human rights defenders to continue their work? Finally, we reiterate our call on the authorities to collaborate immediately with the OHCHR, the treaty bodies, and the group of experts. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, the DPRK is deeply concerned over the continued and growing proliferation of reporting mechanisms and procedures for so-called assessments of the human rights situation in sovereign states without their consent. It is obviously a selective and politically motivated approach, and it proves itself that it is another attempt to manipulate the Human Rights Council in its own geopolitical interests. We reiterate our support to and solidarity with the government of Nicaragua in its efforts to preserve national stability and reconciliation and guarantee legitimate and democratic institutions through dialogue and cooperation with all relevant stakeholders. We strongly urge the HRC to fulfill its mandate to promote and protect human rights on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation in strict compliance with the purposes and principles enshrined in the UN Charter, without resorting to coercion, selectivity, politicization, or double standards implied by the imposition of these hostile mandates against specific countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Burkina Faso is next on my list, but I don't think the delegate is back yet. So, Chile, are you ready to take the floor? Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Our thanks also go to the group of experts for their update, which is all the more relevant given Nicaragua's decision to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. We deeply regret this step taken by Nicaragua, which prevents the state from meaningfully engaging with the deterioration of human rights in the country and the erosion of democracy. One other step that has struck us as deeply troubling is the constitutional reform, which, in the words of the expert group, represents a de facto dissolution of the division of powers and will have harmful consequences for democracy. We also deeply deplore the scrapping of the ban on torture and the withdrawal of the principle of human dignity as a core and fundamental principle. We also deplore the deprivation of liberty and the deprivation of nationality of many political opponents, which has led to a de facto expulsion from the country and a loss of nationality due to, inter alia, their failure to grant them new passports, etc., a crime which has cross-border impact. We call upon the Nicaraguan authorities to take immediate measures to allow international oversight of the situation in the country and to reconsider its decision to withdraw from the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much.
The distinguished representative of Peru.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. Peru also wishes to thank the group of experts for the submission of their most recent report. We reiterate our deep-rooted concern given the ongoing and sustained deterioration of human rights in Nicaragua. We reiterate our alarm in light of the recent constitutional reform in that country, which further undermines and weakens the rule of law, with a severely adverse impact on the separation of powers, undermining democratic principles. Such steps have had a negative and adverse impact on the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms of all Nicaraguans, in particular vulnerable groups such as indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant persons, and those who have been the victims of gender-based and sexual violence. We also deplore the recent decision taken by Nicaragua to disengage from the Human Rights Council and to refuse to engage with any activity carried out under the auspices of this council. We will always support all efforts aimed at restoring dialogue and understanding between Nicaraguans as a precursor to finding a peaceful and long-term solution to the crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, President. Uruguay would also like to thank the High Commissioner and the group of experts for the oral update on the human rights situation in Nicaragua. We very much welcome the report submitted by the group of experts as well. We take this opportunity to reiterate our support for the mandates of the group of experts and the OHCHR. We also take this opportunity to voice once again our concern given the prolonged deterioration of human rights situation in Nicaragua, culminating in the most recent changes to its constitution recently adopted, which imperils the fundamental rights and freedoms of the Nicaraguan people and the separation of powers as well as democracy. We have noted with concern the lack of independence as well as the exploitation of the courts and of justice and of law with the purpose of eradicating any vestiges of opposition, whether that be real, potential or perceived as such. We take this opportunity also to voice our condemnation of the crackdown on Nicaraguan citizens and the stripping of their individual freedoms, a clear violation of international human rights law. Uruguay reiterates its call upon the Nicaraguan government to open channels of cooperation and dialogue with the human rights mechanisms and to allow said human rights mechanisms and groups unfettered access to Nicaraguan territory. We also take this opportunity to call upon the Nicaraguan authorities to reconsider their withdrawal from the Human Rights Council. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the actions taken by Nicaragua are an unmistakable indication of profound failure of this Council. When a nation is pushed to the brink, feeling trapped with no way to escape the suffocating grip this Council has imposed upon us, the only viable option might be to remove ourselves from the equation entirely. We have long tried to call for the Council's mandate to be fulfilled through dialogue and cooperation. The Council should distance itself from politicization, stigmatization, and stereotyping. Politicization of human rights only causes division and confrontation and reduces the human rights into a tool of political agendas. In this context, we oppose initiatives driven by political considerations in the Council that aim to undermine the stability of Nicaragua and obstruct its efforts for peace, reconciliation, combating poverty, and achieving development based on human dignity, and we denounce the unilateral coercive measures directed against it. We emphasize that engagement with the government of Nicaragua and the Human Rights Council must fully respect its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence while upholding the principle of non-interference in its domestic affairs. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia. Error on my list, I apologize. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
President, the Russian Federation notes the unquestionable achievements of the government of co-presidents Ortega and Murillo in promotion and protection of human rights. We categorically reject the politically motivated and irrelevant documents outright condemning Nicaragua for supposed systematic violations of human rights. Their authors deliberately gloss over Managua's success in ensuring gender equality, the rights of ethnic minorities, including indigenous peoples, and workers' rights. In addition, they overlook the positive changes as a result of the socioeconomic transformation. Meanwhile, the constitutional reform adopted by the Nicaraguan parliament has, for the first time in the country's history, enshrined in legislation the socially oriented nature of the state, with guarantees of free education and health care, the rights of citizens to cultural, sporting, and creative development, food security, access to affordable housing, and communal services. We are convinced that the basis for the critical attacks towards Managua is a desire by Western countries to destabilize the domestic political situation in this sovereign state. We consistently advocate for objective, impartial, and depoliticized work in the HRC. We deem it counterproductive to use the Council to exert political pressure on Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to
Mr. President, China welcomes the efforts of the Nicaraguan government in promoting protecting human rights, including developing national education plan to further protect people's economic, social, and cultural rights. We recognize the country's active participation in the fourth round of UPR and its engagement in constructive dialogue. China always opposes the politicization and instrumentalization of the Human Rights Council and opposes using human rights as an excuse to interfere in other countries' internal affairs. We call on the international community to respect the country's sovereign independence and territorial integrity and respect the right of the people to freely choose their own path of development. We oppose certain countries, without the consent of Nicaragua, forcing through resolution relevant to the country and extending the mandate of country-specific mechanism. The practice can only exacerbate confrontation and does not contribute to better protection of human rights. China urges countries concerned to follow the fundamental principles of objectivity, impartiality, non-selectivity, and non-politicization. Immediately remove UCMs against Nicaragua, stop unfounded accusations against the country, and return back to the right path of dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
President, the report on Nicaragua does not reflect the actual state of affairs in that country. Quite the opposite. The report stems from an interventionist, selective, politicized and partisan resolution, one which Cuba rejects wholesale. The only effective way to strengthen the protection of human rights in all countries is through dialogue and cooperation. Dialogue and cooperation that need to be based on respect and non-interference in the internal affairs of states. Nicaragua is a victim of the persistent and ongoing siege enacted by the United States and other countries who justify their actions by claiming that they are acting on the grounds of alleged concerns for human rights. This Council cannot allow itself to be exploited as a tool to further political agendas. Cuba supports the efforts of the government and the people of Nicaragua as they seek to pursue sustainable development.